And I want to personally thank our distinguished panelists for agreeing to take part in what we intend to be a discussion that models civil discourse. By the way, one of our panelists is coming down from Santa Fe, and she ran into an accident, so we're hoping she'll slip in. Fortunately, she was intended to speak last, so, okay. A few days ago, I read an article in the New York Times about an Israeli man and a Palestinian woman who came to the United States in the hopes of contributing to a better understanding of the tragedy that is unfolding in the Middle East. They talked about how horrifying they found the social media-fueled polarization that exists today. We do not want to focus on either that or the Middle East. Rather, our panel is aimed at discussing human rights in a global context. Okay, so with no further ado, I want to introduce Michael Nutkevich, who will moderate the panel and introduce our distinguished panelists.
I'd like to start by thanking Judy Chicago and Donald Woodman and Christine Vasquez and Megan Schultz and the staff of Through the Flower Art Space for hosting us. So the impetus of our program emerged out of a talk I gave here in June on lessons learned and not learned 80 years after the Holocaust and 75 years after the signing of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And like Judy, I too will put on reading classes. At the heart of the talk was the question, given the state of the world, is there anything we can regard as a positive achievement, any large process in the area of human relations that we can be proud of? My answer was yes. I suggested that the most important positive development in post-World War II was the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the hundreds of treaties and covenants that are based on the Declaration. As Johannes Morsink, the historian of the Universal Declaration, writes, quote, "The Universal Declaration is the moral engine of the legal system of international human rights." Why do I think that the Declaration was so important? My reason is that when human rights declarations are uttered, written down, made public, and ratified, they become the gold standard, the touchstone, the referent for all peoples and nations. Once the proposition all men, capital M, are created equal, becomes a public declaration, once it is declared, people will sooner or later demand from the powers that be that the words be taken seriously. I subscribe to Martin Luther King's statement that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Understandably, many people push back and do not have faith in the arc of progress. They ask, looking at the state of the world, does it make any difference that there's a Declaration of Human Rights? Perhaps human nature is fundamentally corrupt, which is why life for so many is, in the words of the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Our program is meant to avoid reviewing the litany of ills in the world. We can close our eyes and lay our finger on virtually any place in the world map and find misery and injustice. And any of these conflicts can overwhelm us, and we can spend the days addressing each. Our intent is to look at human rights broadly and from different perspectives. It's crucial to remember that human rights cover a very large swath of human concerns. They have something to say about inequalities, exclusion, the marginalization of different segments of populations, such as women, indigenous peoples, peoples living with disabilities, among other marginalized folks. They address the rights of religion, employment, property, education, and legal rights. Human rights shape constitutions and constitution writing. And human rights are moving into new areas, such as environmental justice and technologies that, on the one hand, provide resources for human development, but on the other hand, strengthen the repressive capacities of states and bad actors. We can't and won't address, let alone solve, the many issues related to human rights. And we are aware that the current events in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank are all on our minds. We are not turning our eyes away from the suffering of innocent Israelis and Palestinians, nor do we forget the 1.7 million Afghan refugees that Pakistan has begun to deport over its border into Afghanistan, among other very current issues. We know that these are urgent problems, but please keep in mind that our goal today is to convey trends that we see in our particular areas of expertise and in the places and the peoples we work with. Maryam, and I'm going to give a more formal introduction in a second, Maryam Akhranjani comes to us as a scholar of constitutional and human rights, and as a teacher and mentor of the next generation of lawyers. As a reporter, Simon Romero is a witness, observer, and analyst of trends in Mexico and Latin America. And Terry Burnett, who will be here shortly, is coming from Santa Fe. She's here.
She just walked in.
Yay. And Terry perhaps has the hardest job this afternoon as a professional who works with both Israeli and Palestinians to bridge the divide. Her organization, Tomorrow's Women, is an example of what the future might look like, and therefore it gives us hope. So I speak for the entire panel that through our work, although our work often takes us face to face with the bleakest side of humanity, we believe it is possible to find hope even in the darkest places and in the darkest moments. So let me introduce the panel. So Maryam will go first. She is the Ronald and Susan Friedman Professor of Law at the University of New Mexico School of Law. She specializes in constitutional rights, criminal law, and education law. She has taught at American University and the Universidad del Istmo, Facultad de Derecho in Guatemala City. Among other positions, Maryam served as a consultant for the U.S. Department of State, Guatemala, and U.S. Agency for International Development in Guatemala. From 2009 to 2014, she was Associate Director of the Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Program, a program that trains law students to teach public high school students about constitutional rights and responsibilities. Simon Romero, New York Times correspondent for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. Located for many years in Albuquerque, Simon recently moved to Mexico City. He's well known for his reporting on U.S.-Mexico border issues, immigration policy, indigenous sovereignty, and topics in climate change. In 2015, he was awarded Columbia University's Maria Moores Cabot Prize, the oldest international award recognizing journalists who contribute to inter-American understanding. Terry Burnett, Executive Director of Tomorrow's Women. Tomorrow's Women's mission is to prepare a new generation of Palestinian and Israeli young women for leadership roles in their respective communities. Since 2003, the organization has brought small groups of Palestinian and Israeli women to New Mexico to dialogue and develop leadership skills. Terry previously worked with Lutheran Family Services Rocky Mountains, developing nationally recognized mental health and wellness, microfinancing, and sustainable farming initiatives and programs for refugee families. She currently volunteers with the New Mexico Refugee Educational Bridge Project, supporting young women from Afghanistan as they pursue secondary and higher education in the United States. So, I'm going to pose a number of questions to our panelists, and hopefully there'll be then time for Q&A and comments and that sort of thing. So I'm going to start with Mariam. And tell us briefly why and how did you end up in your professional field?
Sure. So I really view myself as a teacher who happens to be a lawyer, rather than a lawyer who happens to be a teacher. I would have, I think, gone into teaching no matter what, and had planned to do that after college, and had a really great advisor in my senior year of college who suggested that I knew about my interest in sort of education systems and systemic work. And I no longer use the word reform because it's overused and also not really, doesn't capture what we're trying to do, I think. So I went to law school on the advice of that professor, and I'm so glad I did because I met amazing colleagues, classmates, and professors who really helped shape my interest in education law primarily. I've always been a big advocate of public education. I am so grateful for the incredible public education that I received, and I also know what is possible because the schools that I went to were incredibly well-resourced. We had dedicated and committed faculty who spent their whole careers in the school system, and I wanted to make, having seen that, I sort of have spent my career trying to figure out ways to make that reality possible for more children, marginalized children, minoritized children, children with disabilities, children in the foster care system. And so, that has really, like the general arc of what I've tried to do in my career is to kind of work on making education more accessible.
Well, lots of people are confused between the difference between human rights and civil rights. What is the difference?
It's a great question, and I'm going to try to give you a very simple answer rather than a very technical one. If you think of concentric circles, I think of human rights as the broader circle, and within that is civil rights. So human rights are, and you already mentioned this, Michael, but pursuant to the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, there's this list of inherent rights that every human, regardless of when we are born, where we are born, should enjoy. And so there's sort of this idea of natural law that comes out of human rights, the idea that the law should protect people because of the fact that we are human. Not because we are landowning white males or because we are in positions of privilege, but because of who we are as human beings. Civil rights are more specific rights that nations create, nations and sub-government entities within nations, so state government, local government, create to I think, give actual rights that are enforceable to human beings, that often are the same as what we would consider to be rights under the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but they can be different as well. They can be more expansive or even less expansive. But so there's some overlap between the two, but civil rights are less, I think, of a aspirational idea and more concrete in terms of enforceability.
Well, you sit in the academy, right? Although obviously you've been in the field. So what's the difference between the work of academicians who study human rights and that of NGOs such as Human Rights Watch?
Great question. So again, there's some overlap. Some academics or academicians work with NGOs, and there are folks that work in NGOs who go into academics sometimes, temporarily or permanently. So there's some overlap, but in terms of the again, broad strokes view of the differences, I would say that academicians are not really limited to how we can study and work on human rights issues. So we can think, we can research, we can theorize, we can also act. We can, and I really focus on legal academicians because that's my field. I don't know that much about what other folks might say about their own fields. But what I would say is that we can file lawsuits. We can take our students to go do fact-finding missions and support the work of NGOs. So there's a lot of activism that academics can do that is really unfettered. I mean, we can sort of pick the issues we want to focus on as legal academicians and do it, just focus on that. NGOs are, and there are lots of different kinds of NGOs, but the idea of the NGO was really created with the UN Charter. And there are some that formally have a role in advising the UN on various substantive issues, and others that are sort of smaller and more focused on the work that they do, maybe less well known. For me in the field, the way I see the difference between academicians and NGOs is that NGOs really focus on the work that they have funding to do. So, and that's also a critique a little bit of NGOs versus academicians. Like, I don't, as a legal academic, I can just decide to write about whatever, and research whatever conflict that I think is important to elevate. We don't have to worry about funding in the same way, so.
Are you ever approached by NGOs for advice?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we can be, and that's important work for sure. And I think I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. So in nations and countries where only a skeletal human rights system is in place, what are the challenges in implementing a human rights value system?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think the biggest challenge to the idea of human rights is enforcement. So all those treaties and conventions and the UN Declaration of Human Rights are, even especially the Declaration, are really soft law. They're not really enforceable. Whereas countries who create their own civil rights systems that are internal systems that support the rule of law are often offer swifter justice, can be more preventative in focus, and there can be pretty significant changes within a country resulting from lawsuits, for example, or changes in legislation that have to do with the rights that we would consider to be human rights. So with regard to your question about what we do in nations where there's only a skeletal human rights system, I think the real focus is on how do you build up the rule of law internally in that country. And when we talk about rule of law, I don't want to assume any knowledge for those in the room or even those who are watching. That's to be contrasted with the rule of man. And I say man because that's really what we're worried about, that this happened over the course of human history is, individuals who are in power who make decisions that are their own, that are not reliant on democratic governance and contributions, but rather just a person or a group of people who rule a country without an internal check and balance system, like a judiciary that is independent, right? You have decision makers who are independent. You have law enforcement, that's reliable and well funded. You have public prosecution and public defense that is, again, well enough supported that they can actually, prosecute and defend people who are accused of committing crimes. Those are all part of the rule of law, and those are things that countries can do to build up support for, human rights, support against human rights violations.
Well, who are the mentors then of governments who have an ambiguous or a poor history? Where do they find the people who are teaching rule of law in their country?
Okay, so
I know the UN has
the
programs.
UN has programs, absolutely, and other international organizations have programs, and you know, they're big banks like the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank in Latin America, same thing in other regions of the world that offer lots of support, technical support, to train up rule of law systems and actors. The American Bar Association, which is the largest voluntary professional association in the world, we have about 400,000 members, does a lot of work on helping to build rule of law initiatives across the world by sending, for example, academicians and prosecutors and, you know, defense lawyers and judges to other countries to just talk about the work that we do and how we do what we do, whether it's plea bargaining. Our system of plea bargaining is a big example of that. I think the danger there is always to be humble about the fact that we have still lots of problems in our own nation, and our civil rights system is far from perfect. We're still working toward that, you know, arc that Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King talked about. So I think it's important to maintain that humility, but also to offer resources in the ways that we can.
Okay, interesting. Well, in June, we spoke a little bit about this, but I'm going to bring it up. Many legal scholars and people who monitor the health of democracies have warned about democratic decline. So the process goes something like this. Charismatic new leaders are elected, and then use their electoral mandates to legally dismantle the constitutional system they inherit. This process occurred in Hungary, in Turkey, in Israel, in Poland, although that recent election, hopefully maybe will turn back, Venezuela, and the United States, among other countries. So scholars term this phenomenon autocratic legalism. Conservatives call it rights renewal. What are the options for kind of resisting, is a big question, resisting and pushing back on this attempt to appropriate or misappropriate rights?
Thank you, Michael, for this question. And if anyone's interested, there's a sociologist named Kim Lane Chappelli who has written about this exact question that you posed, and the idea of autocratic legalism. In fact, she has a 2018 law review article published by the University of Chicago Law Review entitled Autocratic Legalism, and she addresses this. The whole point of her article was to describe this phenomenon that you articulated and to talk about what we can do about it. And in that article, she proposes a couple of things, and I think to any of us who work, you know, on human rights or public interest issues, generally they won't sound surprising. But the first is to really track in detail what's happening, to document what is happening, the ways in which these systems are being overtaken by autocrats, whether it's stacking the judiciary with people who are going to have a particular voting, you know, who have a particular voting pattern, but also future. That's one example. But it's important to document these what she calls signs of danger, because it leads into her next major suggestion, which is really to educate others about what is happening. And so she talks a lot about, and this is close to my heart, the idea of civic education. You know, I think one of the things that I love so much about teaching is it gives me a chance to constantly be learning, and I really firmly believe that we have to continuously learn, and we also have to be continuously, all of us, teaching those around us what we know, especially young people. I think sometimes we assume that what we know everybody else knows, right? Or our values are clear. The idea of treating people with respect and equality, that's a clear value. But you know, a lot of those are learned values, sadly. And so when Professor Chappelli talks about the idea of civic education as a tool to combat autocratic legalism, it is so powerful. And the Marshall Brennan Project is an example of that, where we have law students all across the country who are going in to teach high school students, mostly in high schools in which students don't have access to any positive interactions with lawyers or law enforcement. So they're minority, communities. Mostly students come from low-income families in the schools in which we teach. And those are exactly the people that are most likely to have their rights trampled on. So our law students go in and teach the students about what the Constitution actually says, and oftentimes they're even teaching the adults in the space what the Constitution actually says. In fact, I'm really proud of some of my UNM students this semester, one of whom actually did a whole training for the entire faculty at the high school in which he teaches about the Fourth Amendment, what the Fourth Amendment does and doesn't protect in the public school setting. And then I have another pair of students that are going to be working with a colleague in the College of Education at UNM. And if we think about it, the young educators today, were born just before or after 9/11, which is really a turning point in terms of our public understanding of privacy and individual rights. We have really given up a lot of rights in the post 9/11 era that many young people just take for granted, that there are going to be metal detectors everywhere, including in public schools, and law enforcement officers everywhere, despite concerns about the efficacy of all of those efforts. So anyway, my students are going to be talking to some of these education students who are going to be teachers about, again, the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment and the protections against compelled self-incrimination, which unfortunately also has become commonplace in public schools. We have criminalized all sorts of normal, youthful behavior that ends up having very harsh consequences for young people in the immediate term and in their long-term futures. And a lot of that is through forcing them to confess about things that they've done. So,
is the Brennan program just found at UNM, or is it?
No, actually, it started at my law school when I was in law school at American. Jamie Raskin, who is now a member of Congress, was a longtime professor there, and he started the project with Steve Wormeal, who is a longtime constitutional law professor as well, was a journalist for many years, actually. He covered the Supreme Court for the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe, and then went into law school and law teaching. And they co-founded the project, and this is our 25th anniversary year, so now you know how old I am. But the UNM chapter is about 12 years old. Yeah.
That's great. Well, let me, I guess, end with the last question for you, which is, what initiatives give you hope besides the Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project? What initiatives do give you hope for a deeper engagement with human rights?
Well, honestly, this conversation today gives me a lot of hope. It does. I think, I suspect we all came for different reasons, and I look forward to the conversation to hear more. But I just think, in general, having public dialogues about what can be sensitive topics. We're not going to agree on everything. In fact, I always tell my students, I think disagreement is healthy, and it's something that we should embrace. We will get to better ideas if we can respectfully disagree with one another. So I think any forum in which we have opportunities to talk and learn from one another gives me hope. Yeah.
Simone, how did you end up in your professional field?
Well, it's a great question, Michael. Thank you. Thank you, Judy and Donald, for organizing this and having us here today.
I just want to say this, Mom came all the way from Mexico City.
Thank you, and very honored to be here. So I kind of had like a roundabout path to covering issues involving human rights and civil society. So I started out as an economics journalist, basically, and for the first 10 years of my career, I was covering financial markets. I worked for Bloomberg News, and then the New York Times hired me to cover Brazil's economy, and so then I went on to cover technology and the oil industry, and so that was really my overwhelming focus, was the world of business and finance. I was writing about the stock market and the bond market and energy markets and everything. And then the newspaper decided to send me to Venezuela, to Caracas, to be the bureau chief there. And It was a fascinating time to arrive. It was in 2006, and it was kind of like the height of Hugo Chavez's power, and certainly the money was flowing into the public coffers in Venezuela. Oil prices were extremely high, and it was something you said was Miriam was so interesting about the stacking of the judiciary, because that had just happened before I had arrived. And so you saw the Supreme Court changing in composition, and from there that influenced everything involving rule of law in Venezuela, the way that institutions work, and people hoping to have recourse in a court of law and not having that. That just sort of set the tone for the years to come. But of course, Venezuela wasn't the only country I was covering. I was going to Colombia regularly to cover the long internal war that was being waged there, and it was an education, just on the ground, seeing atrocities that had been done by every different actor in that conflict, regardless of ideology. People in the government, people in the armed forces, people in the different guerrilla groups. They were all just terrible and unbelievable atrocities. And one story that I covered was extremely educational for me, and it was a scandal involving what they call in Colombia the false positives, and these were civilians who were killed by army units in Colombia, and then subsequently dressed in guerrilla fatigues and counted as part of their kill count, because every one of these units had a certain goal of guerrillas that they had to kill in a specific period of time. And it turned out that they were actually just pulling people off the streets like on the outskirts of Bogota, in the capital of Colombia, and claiming that these innocent people were guerrillas, and these were hundreds and hundreds of cases. And so I spent time with the families who were affected by this, and of course, the Colombian military at that time was receiving a huge amount of aid from the United States. The counterinsurgency was really the most, sort of like the marquee part of like the Bush administration at that time. At that time, their policy in Latin America, Colombia was the top ally of that administration, and it really just opened my eyes in terms of like seeing like what institutions are capable of in conflicts like those. And then from there, after some years in Venezuela, I was transferred to Brazil to cover the southern cone of Latin America. And it was a very kind of like a heady time. Brazil at that time was led by Dilma Rousseff, who was a former Marxist revolutionary involved in a guerrilla group, who was arrested by the Brazilian military dictatorship, detained and severely tortured during her time in jail. She got out and went into a life of politics and ended up being elected Brazil's president at that time. And I sort of covered the whole arc of her administration, and then saw the reaction to her leadership, which was personified by Jair Bolsonaro, who really made his mark. He was always considered to be on the margins of Congress, sort of like this guy yelling into the wilderness. But then he latched onto one specific issue where he glorified the torturers who had tortured Dilma Rousseff on the floor of Congress when they were in the process of impeaching her. And that helped to really put him in the spotlight and on the path to the presidency. And it really brought home for me how a place like Brazil really stood in contrast to neighboring countries like Argentina or Chile, which after their dictatorships had done a lot to go after the military leaders who had overseen those crimes. In Brazil, that never happened. There was essentially a handshake agreement between the military dictatorship and the civilians who came in afterward, that no one was going to be prosecuted. There was going to be amnesty for everybody. And lo and behold, in a country which never really came to terms with its memory of that time, including many people who were alive who suffered terribly, you had the election of someone like Bolsonaro, who could come in and actually glorify torturers. And it saddens me to say this, but many people, that was extremely appealing to many people in Brazil at that time. And it still is. The country is still, like ours, is still extremely divided. So from there, I came back to the United States, and I was based in Albuquerque, and I was covering a lot of issues, along the U.S.-Mexico border. One of those issues is just the construction of the border wall. I spent a lot of my time on the border, following that whole process and everything, and seeing how we were constantly squeezing people into more remote areas, much more perilous crossings. A lot of people were dying. And then during the previous administration, you had these policies like family separation and detaining kids for very long periods of time. And I really don't know exactly how future generations, how future historians are going to look at that time. This time, we're still in that era, really, and view that treatment of how we're treating people on the border, and how we still are treating people on the border. Lastly, from there, I've now started a new posting in Mexico City, and so I cover a lot of the same issues again. I spend a lot of my time now in Central America, which is really now formed by various different authoritarian enclaves. And if you strip away the ideology, you have a place like Nicaragua, which is on the left. You have a place like El Salvador, which is on the right. Both of them are pursuing very similar policies in terms of curbs on freedom of expression, freedom of movement, crackdowns on civil society groups, the hounding of journalists and human rights workers. And perhaps the most insidious example of all is, and if we talk about autocratic legalism, is taking place in Guatemala right now, where it's almost a textbook example of a government using laws to go after its enemies, whether they are journalists, civil rights workers, opposition politicians, you name it. These are public prosecutors that are really at the vanguard of this process. There is a real glimmer of hope, though, in Guatemala, because there's been an election now with 2 rounds, and the guy who won, who is probably going to be Guatemala's next president, Bernardo Arevalo, is an incredible anti-corruption crusader. And right now he's actually being hounded by these prosecutors, and they're trying to lift his immunity and go after him and really kneecap him before he takes power in January. But it's an amazing story to be covering.
Is there a similar process in Argentina?
Argentina is fascinating, actually, especially since they're about to have an election tomorrow and choose a new president. Argentina took a very different approach than Brazil did, and really almost immediately after their dictatorship collapsed in the 80s, there was an accountability process where you had judges really go in and treat members of the military leadership very rigorously and very harshly. It really created some of the first civil society groups to be known globally. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, for example, who are still out there today, just trying to find their missing children and hold those, accountable for people who kidnapped them and tortured and killed them. And then other human rights organizations also grew out of the Argentine experience. And yet, you have someone like Javier Milei in Argentina tomorrow. He's almost on the cusp, possibly, of being elected. And he is someone who views that whole period in a different kind of way. And I think that, some of it has to do with, there are new generations, but there's also a kind of like a war over memory in Argentina and how that time is remembered. And there's certainly a kind of like an insurgent part of Argentine politics that he represents, where people just want to forget all about that, and we have to deal with the economic problems that we have right now in the country and move forward. So it's going to be an amazing election tomorrow.
Which countries kind of give you the most hope?
You know, honestly, Brazil really has my heart as a country, and I've spent most, you know, sort of like a big part of my career here. They had one term of Bolsonaro as president, and they managed to elect someone else. Lula is back in power. And they've also moved rather quickly, more quickly than I would say we have in the United States in terms of holding our previous president accountable for various things he may or may not have done in office. But they've been very, very fast in terms of doing something about Bolsonaro and his ability to run again. And Brazil is also a place where you have just an incredibly vibrant civil society, you know, human rights groups. And these are, you know, there's a lot of cross-pollination with international groups, with groups like Human Rights Watch, but there are also excellent Brazilian human rights groups who work on the ground in urban places like Sao Paulo or Rio, but also in the Amazon basin, which is kind of, you know, you see all of this breakneck deforestation, and a lot of land rights are an issue there, and incredible people working on the ground.
And which country worries you the most at this point?
Boy, that's a really good question. It's hard to single out one country. And having had the experience of reporting kind of now on, you know, both sides of the border, I'm hesitant to single one out. I think we kind of have like a long history in this country of kind of like telling others what's right and wrong. And I think maybe we've lost that moral authority. You know?
Maybe.
It makes it harder for, you know, for like the State Department, for example, to go out and say, oh, you have to do this and this and this, and respect rule of law and respect an independent judiciary and the rule, you know, Congress and free and fair elections. And we're dealing with those issues here.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely. So when you meet with, presumably you meet with human rights activists or civil society activists in Mexico, what do they talk about?
They're afraid. They're afraid. I mean, I recently went on a reporting trip in western Mexico in the state of Michoacan, which is a place where, you know, different criminal organizations, organized crime, you could call them cartels, you could call them something bigger than that. They're really kind of spreading their tentacles into many different areas of the economy. And Mexico is an incredibly dangerous place to be a human rights activist or a human rights defender. Many of them are, I mean, this was just a few weeks ago, I interviewed people who were abducted, who were held at gunpoint, who were beaten. There are other cases right in that area where activists have been killed. And these things happen just, you know, it reminds me of Colombia, unfortunately, another country that's extremely dangerous for human rights defenders. You know, some of this involves kind of like the vilification of people who work in the field of human rights. There was a phrase that I heard quite often in Peru, which is Peru is a country that's gone through a lot of different issues, a guerrilla insurgency, the Shining Path, and Fujimori cracking down. And there's a phrase that they use there, that los caviares, the caviar, like the caviar eaters, making it seem like, oh, human rights activists are going to cocktail parties and drinking champagne and eating caviar all the time. Like there are these elitists who are coming in and telling us what to do, you know. And that depiction has some currency with some people. And so it can really make people who work in the field extremely vulnerable. And that's something I've seen in country after country in the region, which is really quite unfortunate.
Many people don't connect the role of corruption in undermining democracy. Can you speak about how corruption impacts the road to democracy?
Well, Yeah, in a place where you can essentially buy a legal ruling, that translates into impunity. And you see this in a place like Brazil, where the legal system is just is labyrinthine and complex, and to even get a basic legal ruling just takes years and years and years. It wears people down, and there is corruption involved in that. But then you have places with much more explicit corruption, like Venezuela, where and Venezuela was an imperfect democracy before Chavez arrived. There were reasons why he was elected, absolutely. But what happened when he went in and eroded the checks on the different institutions had on one another, and really centralizing power in himself and his own administration, just changed everything. And so in a country where there's a big pot of money from oil, there's an incentive to get your hands on that any way possible. And again, regardless of the ideology or the rhetoric that may be coming out of a government like that, you just have to look at the results and see, and just see how vulnerable people come, and as a result, you've had this huge exodus of people from Venezuela. Some 4 to 5 million people have had to leave the country. That's in a country that should be extremely prosperous and doing very well.
They kind of throw their hands up because they see that the corruption, they don't have a chance in the context of a corrupt.
Especially for someone who wants to have like a small business and just do it like legitimately. You have to, it's extremely difficult. There's regulations that you have to follow, and then you have police coming by, and there's extortion rackets and everything, and people end up spending a lot of time and money on those things.
What's it like for journalists in Latin America, Mexico, Latin America, and maybe South America, both foreign and domestic journalists?
Frightening as well. I should say that, people who are international correspondents who work for large organizations like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or, I think we enjoy greater protections than our colleagues who are working domestically. It's especially true in a place like Mexico, where being a journalist is a very deadly profession. But if you just look all around the region, there's a great amount of intimidation of journalists. The president of Mexico clashes on a daily basis with journalists. He singles them out by name. He has a daily news conference in the morning that I watch every morning, and it's extremely interesting. But there's a real intimidation process there, and I think that produces a lot of self-censorship in some cases as well. People become hesitant to report on certain subjects, on certain leaders, and it has a chilling effect.
About schools of journalism in some of the major universities, do you ever interact with them? Or?
I do, yeah. There are excellent schools of journalism, especially, I'm going to mention Brazil again, but it's just, it's the biggest country in the region, and it has many, many different universities and incredibly dedicated people. So there's still a lot of people going into the profession, which is quite amazing, given the turbulence that we've been experiencing since the kind of like the start of the century in media. And it's really inspiring too, to see that. And people who are super intrepid, they're really, they're going into very remote places and doing very, very challenging types of reporting. So I love going into
still
schools.
Robust.
It's still robust,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Good. That's good. That's hopefully the future.
Yes.
Without doubt.
Yeah.
Without doubt.
I want to ask you something about the border, since you have done reporting on the border. The Migration Policy Institute, which is a very fine research center on policy issues, reported just a few days ago that for the first time ever, migrants from beyond Mexico and Central and Northern Central America represent a majority of border encounters. I have a friend who is a federal immigration judge in San Francisco, and he said they are seeing people from India, they're seeing people from the Stans, Kazakhstans, and other places. Just kind of a, maybe it's speculative, but how does this new fact, you think, impact your understanding of the immigration crisis?
Well, first of all, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I've been right there on the border. I was in like Juarez and El Paso a couple of weeks ago, and you see it, you see it firsthand. So a lot of folks from China, a lot of folks from India and Pakistan, a lot of people from different African countries. There's a route where they can fly into Nicaragua relatively easily, and then from there just take buses and trains all the way up to the border. So it's kind of changing the perception of migration, I think, in both Mexico and the United States. You know, in Mexico, really, the Mexican government is kind of like emerged as an enforcer of U.S. migration policies. I think, you know, where the Biden administration has reached an understanding with its Mexican counterparts to really keep a lot of the migrants in Mexico and often bust them away from border cities, you know, deeper into like, you know, northern and central Mexico. And it makes it kind of easier for the Mexican authorities to do that if those migrants are not from Mexico or from neighboring Central American countries. So it's a really important turn of events, and it also reflects somewhat on the places that those migrants are coming from. I mean, you mentioned India. I mean, India is an incredibly vibrant and fast-growing economy, but it's also, you know, it has its own issues with, you know, criticisms of its own current government and leadership and everything, and how that may be impacting people or influencing them to stay or not.
Well, that's an interesting, I mean, I think that's something that we'll be reading about more and more, the fact that people from other places are coming to our borders and how the government deals with that. Well, what does give you hope for the future?
You know, just meeting, whenever I meet with human rights, people working in the field of human rights, and human rights activists, I mean, it's just so amazing. Like, despite it being an incredibly deadly profession, there are extremely good people doing this work in all of these different countries. I mean, even in a place like Nicaragua, which is, you know, the government there has made it impossible for these organizations to receive any funding from abroad. I mean, they're going after, I mean, they've gone after all of these civil society and groups and NGOs, but they're also going after the Catholic Church now, because that's one of the last remaining sources of dissent in the country. So they're hounding priests now from the, you know, from Nicaragua. Even there are still people working on the ground doing this work, and I find that like just legitimately amazing. Always come into contact with them.
Hi, Terry.
Hi, Michael. Hi.
Well, how did you end up in your professional field?
Well, thank you all for welcoming me, for being gracious. I appreciate it. It's nice to be here. Well, you know, right where I'm at now really feels like a confluence of many things in my life. So I studied gender studies as an undergraduate, and then for graduate school, I focused on, I was in social work, but focused on international social work with a focus on trauma. And then doing refugee resettlement work for 10 years. That's where I got to meet you. Okay, sure. I don't really know how. How do I turn this up? Oh, okay. All right, I can talk louder. Is that better? That's good? Okay. And doing refugee resettlement for the last decade, both in Colorado and New Mexico. And then, you know, seeing this opportunity to work essentially in an active conflict zone, but to work on civil society with young people, with young women. As the mother of a daughter, it's a huge confluence of many things I love.
Can you describe the mission and activities of Tomorrow's Women? And do you have a...
Sure, I do.
do you
Yeah.
have a- Okay.
So maybe I'll share a little bit about it. We can watch just a very short video. I just want to really bring it to life for everyone, and then talk a little bit about what's happening right now. So our organization, this is our 20th anniversary. I took over the organization about 5 years ago. And our focus is really on bringing young women together. So it all started with a camp that you'll kind of get to see in this video, and we do it every year. So it's a 3-week, very intensive immersion where young women from Israel, so Jewish Israelis, also Arab Israelis, Palestinians who live in Israel, and then also in the West Bank. In the early years before the Gazan blockade, we had young women from Gaza, but that hasn't happened for, long over a decade. And they'll come and they'll spend 40 hours of facilitated dialogue with Israeli and Palestinian facilitators who are on staff. And they also do creative and therapeutic art as part of this immersion. And at the end, there's magic, right, in building civil society in this very intensive way at this juncture, right, before a lot of their identity has been formed. They can come together and really connect on that very human, and that as another young woman who lives, miles apart from the other, they connect in very powerful ways. So after that connection is then when we start to build leadership skills. So they'll continue on. Most of my staff live and work in the region. So they sort of start here outside of the conflict and then get to go back. And then they engage with us. I mean, the average alum is with us for 8 years or more.
Is it a good time to show the clip?
Sure, yeah, maybe I'll share a little bit more just kind of about our methodology
Okay,
and
good.
then show that.
Yeah.
So we really see our work as sort of track to diplomacy, right? So not at the level of military or political officials, but really at the level of civil society, and even kind of a notch down, right? These are young people that are eventually, we hope, are going to go in. We've got journalists, we've got doctors, we've got young women who are true activists, human rights defenders, Israelis living in the West Bank. I mean, these are all of our alums doing really amazing work. That sense of track to diplomacy starts with compassionate dialogue. So some of the things you talked about, is just literally coming together and learning how to agree to disagree. I mean, these young women have, this is one of the most protracted conflicts in the world, and they have generations and stories that they bring with. I mean, it's so deep, and to be able to sort of pull that apart and see each other, that's what happens in those 40 hours of dialogue. So compassionate listening, and then authentic speaking, right? So how do we just not tear each other apart? How do we talk to each other? They learn those skills, and then the emotional sort of resilience, how to sit and stay in those spaces when you're really activated. It's a life skill, right, that we all can use. And then it's the leadership skill building, and that's really key, that it's not just dialogue, that they continue on. And they learn how to really engage in their communities at any level, whether that's being a mother and changing generational narratives, or it's working for the Harvard Negotiation Project. At all levels is where we hope that they insert themselves. So yeah, we can share it.
Okay.
I'm done with killing. I'm done with shooting. I'm really done with hurting. I realize that we are the victims of this stupid conflict. We, Palestinians and the Israeli side, young people like us, are the victims. So I just want to live in peace.
We're an international nonprofit that's based here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we work to do peacemaking work in Israel and Palestine. Young women aged 15 to 17 are recruited in Israel and Palestine through our staff there. The camp is really how it all began, and it's a 3-week, very intensive transformational process. And it's based in about 40 hours of dialogue that's facilitated by professional Israeli and Palestinian facilitators. One of our mottos is, an enemy is only someone whose story you've never heard.
So my name is Luna. I'm 19 years old. I'm a Palestinian living in Israel.
I'm Sivan Kedenwinker. I'm 32. I live in Tel Aviv.
I've never talked about being bullied because of my identity or the stuff that I had experienced. And camp really gave me the option to talk about it and open up about it.
I began as a camper, and I had a really life-changing experience. I think it's very important. It's always been important because the way we share our stories is the power we have. And this is what I think Women of Tomorrow is based on, about the ability to share my story, to have people hearing me, and the ability to listen.
I want to reach the peace, to reach the goal. My goal is to make peace with the Jewish girls, with the Palestine girls, to have fun with them also, not to just cry, just to share our bad feelings.
Like this, but you weren't there, and I tell you from my experience that the trust that we had for each other is not something that you can throw away.
They also do therapeutic art. And the goal of that is not so much art making as it is helping them release a lot of these deep emotions as they're going through this process.
We did a collage that I really liked. It was a collage of war and peace. It really made us think a lot. Why are we in this situation? Do we know what's peace at all? I mean, what is peace? I never lived in peace.
To see the transformation happen between two people that are essentially told to be enemies and that they should hate each other. And yet after 3 weeks of sitting in a circle, eating together, sleeping in the same rooms, doing ropes courses and bonding, that it can so quickly be broken down and the humanity can be seen so clearly in such a short amount of time. And that these are lifetime relationships that many of these young women still have.
The girls that I met, I talked to a lot of them until now.
It's easy to hate when you don't know the other person. It's easy to say, yeah, they should die, they should not be here, but then when you meet the people and when they become your friends, they cannot be your enemy.
Every time someone mentions tomorrow's women, it makes me smile.
Being able to share that story on a much broader level with the goal of sharing the inspiration and lifting up the voices of these brave young women. Through this, not only will more people learn about our program, they will support it so that we can continue to do this good work.
Well, to the extent that you can communicate last month with your Israeli and Palestinian participants and staff, what can you tell us about the current situation and how they're faring?
It's actually really hard to watch that video now. Sort of there's this before and this after, and I think one of the biggest realizations that I've had since October 7th is that this is like nothing else. I mean, of course, like the numbers and the numbers of people that have been massacred and killed and now in Gaza. I mean, we can look at the numbers, but it's also just there's going to be a before and an after, right? That Israelis and I think Jews around the world have this sense of like another Holocaust, right? I mean, in a way, right? This was supposed to be a place that was very safe and a place where they could feel safe. And so it's like, what's next? So there's a lot of this existential fear that has now become real. And then on the other side, you have, this is sort of the second Nakba, right? The second big disaster since 1948. And that their existential fear has now been realized. And so, there was already just a very fragile peace-building, peacemaking community. I would venture to say since, Yitzhak Rabin and the Oslo Accords that now is ripped apart, and it just feels like there's this massive, massive gap to overcome that could take generations. And so, our work is just such a a small part of the larger movement, and I don't know what the future of the peace-building movement will look like in Israel and Palestine. Certainly the war has to end before we can sort of pick up the pieces and one of the major things that we're doing is uninational work. So what you saw was all what we consider binational work, sort of bringing the young women together for this encounter, which takes a lot of work. You can't just sort of put people together and expect it to go well. And it doesn't go well. There's this whole arc, of them sort of storming and coming apart and then coming back together. And then imagine, adults that have lived this, whether it's occupation or fear, for their entire lives, trying to come together. And so we're doing uninational groups, meaning so it's just Israelis with Israelis and Palestinians with the Palestinians, and it's facilitated. And that's what most of the peace-building organizations are doing now. Just to sort of respond to the moment while it's still very, very active and very tense.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of what my question maybe you've just answered. I wondered, will tomorrow's women itself have to change to remain useful in a post-October 7th world?
It's a really good question, and I don't have a clear answer because it's, what are we, 41 days in or 43 days into this war and this moment? My gut sense is that absolutely. And in fact, this has just galvanized many people that we have to work harder. We're more committed to this work. She's an expert facilitator. She lives in a place called Neve Shalom, Waha Asalam, which is one of the original binational communities in Israel. There's very few exist anymore. This one still does. They have a school. They teach dialogue facilitation. And she works with our facilitators to sort of facilitate them, because what I learned very quickly is the conflict is never not in the room, and you have to attend to it to continue to do the work. And she said to me, a weekend, and she knew of a lot of people that died in that original massacre that happened on the 7th, because she worked and taught in the South. And she said, I am more clear than I have ever been that the only way out is together, and is through this together. And I really believe that. And our work will have to shift. We may not get to have our camp this summer, or we might bring our alums, some of our most distinguished alums, back together to deepen and to connect with each other.
So are there any questions in the audience that are here that you would like to ask any of our panelists?
My question is to all three of you. I haven't heard the word human trafficking come up in terms of human rights. I'm just wondering if you would address that briefly.
Well, it's something that we're covering quite a lot at the New York Times. I mean, I cover more the side of it that takes place in Latin America, not really in the United States anymore. But human trafficking is just an immense and lucrative industry now in Mexico, especially in northern Mexico. But it's an industry. It's a trade that extends all the way into South America as well. You see it in the Darien Gap, where where people make quite a lot of money guiding migrants across that stretch of jungle, you know, dividing Colombia and Panama. And there are just huge incentives to keep on doing this, essentially. I think, well, you know, when we have an immigration system that is, you know, everybody kind of like on all the different sides of the issue acknowledges that the system is broken and it isn't functioning as well as it should. It creates these incentives for people to try to find alternate ways of getting into this country. So it's really hard to see that stopping anytime soon.
Why did you ask that question?
Yeah.
Because it's such a huge issue and it's such a fundamental human rights issue.
Yeah.
And it affects, especially from a female trafficking issue.
Yeah.
Right.
I actually have read this last year that this government at least talks a lot about the drug trafficking, but more money is made from human trafficking than it is from the drug trafficking. So it doesn't get the play, I think, in this country that it should. So thanks for the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm thinking back to Michael's question about the difference between human rights and civil rights and the overlap, that in the United States we recognize under federal law and state laws the importance of combating trafficking of human beings, and that we've seen some advances in terms of understanding how it works and trying to signal to members of the public what it is that we should be looking out for to try to stop trafficking. And so, you know, just some of the things that have happened in recent years are signage and warnings in airports that we've all seen, you know, and in workplaces, also for people to understand what trafficking looks like and what to do if you suspect that you saw a child or a woman or anyone who's been trafficked, that we now have. And we, you know, the U.S. government has anti-trafficking, you know, task forces and representatives from different agencies that meet regularly, and they have to do compliance and reporting work around what they're doing to stop human trafficking. So those are examples of like civil rights. Again, this sort of more enforceable framework that is tangible, and there are ways to kind of prevent and punish violations of that particular kind of human right.
I would like to say something about trafficking, because of course we were going to talk about I would like to say something about trafficking, because if you're going to talk about the trafficking of human beings, mostly women, you have to look at it in a global context of trafficking all creatures who are considered lesser, including all the horrible trafficking in other species that goes all around the world. So, I mean, because other species are not considered, do not even enjoy a pretense of rights, that is almost totally unregulated, totally unprosecuted. But I think if we're going to stop trafficking, then we have to stop the whole dehumanization of women and other creatures on the planet. And that is a big human rights issue that I don't even think is often discussed.
No, you're absolutely right. I talked that in my introduction about new areas in the human rights world, and one of them actually is the rights of non-human species. Martha Nussbaum was a very distinguished professor of law and philosophy, has just published a book on this, and Peter Singer, another famous philosopher. So there's been work on this, but it's not well known in the general public.
If I can just add something on that point, Judy, I think we have better research and more understanding of the connections between abuse of animals and abuse of women and others. And the criminal law recognizes that in some jurisdictions, by trying to treat very harshly abuse of animals, because people who abuse animals are likely to abuse humans as well. So there's some states that have been really at the forefront of that. In our country.
How would you suggest an average citizen advocate and work toward a better future?
One of the things I've been talking a lot about, and I've been asked to speak a lot at this moment, as you can well imagine, is something that we can do on a personal level. I have two thoughts about it. One is just that, many of us are on social media and sharing, and even if just sharing of articles, and just always, it's so easy to become even more polarized in that space. And so we have a standard of conduct for our own alums and our staff, and I just encourage everyone to, is what I'm sharing, is it going to bring us together, or is it going to divide? And it's just a very simple question to ask ourselves, whatever we're doing, like what's behind this? What are we trying to create? Because that to me is like one of the bases of civil society. And then the second is compassionate listening. I'm obviously a huge proponent of it, personally and professionally. The Compassionate Listening Project, you can find it, they're one of our partners. And just learning those skills can transform an interaction, which I think has major ripple effects into how we behave in our communities and societies.
I would add to do some deep research on the organizations, the NGOs that resonate with you. And there are more than you think of people who have come together to do social justice education, social justice activism, and I don't know if it's appropriate to say, if we could find some way to list online a half a dozen.
Flower can't do it because we can't do political work. We're a 501c3.
Right, yeah. Well, it's interesting whether, the question is whether an NGO that, like, I don't know, Terry's isn't an NGO, but work like what Terry's group does is considered political work in contrast to education. But we should find a way in which maybe we could recommend responsible groups that are doing really responsible work. But I think that's a way, whether we find a way or not, it's really up to the audience, I think, to do some deep research on civil society organizations and NGOs.
I'd like to add one other suggestion. I see there's a hand in the back. One other suggestion, I think, when we're feeling like there are these very big issues and what can I do about this very big issue? One is to contribute, financially. But also we can just start in really tiny ways, so small, like the most local way you can think of. Like, am I treating the people in my life the way that I want to treat those people? Are they treating me the way that I want to be treated? Can I work on those, relationships and repairing those pathways of communication and really compassionate listening? And then to build out from that, right? The people that I work with, the people in my neighborhood, and just really to start so small. And imagine if we all did that, what that would mean, right?
My name is Pam Perez. I'm also here from Santa Fe, but I beat the accident. What you just described is so beautiful because it sounds to me like what I was thinking. Is there some kind of a spiritual answer to all this? And what you've just described, we call the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. And of course, if there was much more of that going on everywhere, individual basis, families, communities, countries, nations, it would certainly make a difference. But I was really struck by Mr. Romero's comment about the war over memory. That is huge when you think about what is going on in the world now, what goes on intergenerationally, where we learn from our parents and we teach our kids the same old values that are not working, and over, that cycle is repeated. And so I wanted to talk to you about instances that you've seen. I've been in a lot of the countries you have, and so it really warms my heart to hear you speaking about them in the way that you do. The process of maybe kind of decolonization, we call it, or reconditioning ourselves, or somehow making new spaces in our lives for the dialogue and the action that needs to take place that aren't the old spaces where we learned them, but new spaces that we need. Have you seen examples of that? Are you able to talk about hope in that way, of places in the world where, you know, aside from just people and NGOs and human rights workers, but is there a movement, is there an organization, is there a revolution going on anywhere that you've seen that you can point out that might give us some hope?
Well, thank you. That's just such a wonderful question. I mean, kind of like the issues around memory and are just something that I've really been interested in for like a long time, and how they resonate and how they change over time, right? How societies choose to remember certain traumatic events in their past differently over a stretch of time. And I kind of think that those of us in journalism, that we come almost like at the end of the process, and that people who are in the arts are often far ahead of us in terms of seizing on these issues with courage and taking them on when other parts of society just don't do that. One place that comes to mind is Cuba, you know, which is an amazing society in where I've reported from, and there are, I mean, Cuba has a very strong education system and a very strong health system, and it's succeeded in providing its citizens with those things. But it's also a place where it's extremely challenging to do the type of journalism that we do. There is no freedom of expression, and it really is an authoritarian system. And yet there's a part of Cuban society where filmmakers especially take on issues that those of us in journalism would normally be covering and be writing about. And they do it in an amazing way. I think that Cuba just has this incredible cinematic tradition before the revolution, but especially since the revolution. And I think that's just an example of just how, you know, of how the process starts almost. And in Brazil, you see sort of like a similar thing where, you know, people in the arts and people, especially in the movie making industry, are just really ahead of the pack. And I find it quite inspiring and quite informing as a journalist. I mean, we're relying on many different types of sources, but like the discussions that are kind of like unleashed by works of art, and in different realms are, I think they often sort of like open the way for the rest of society to start taking on those subjects.
First of all, I read an article by David Remick, Donald gave it to me, in the New Yorker, about how, as tempting as it is to succumb to pessimism, we cannot do it. Also, I think making change requires two things. One, it requires believing that one person can make a difference, that you can make a difference. I think my career actually demonstrates that one person can make a difference, but as Simon pointed out, making change is not without risks. The other thing is that making change is a lot more than going to a protest and posting on Instagram. Making change requires a lifelong commitment to making change. And there is actually a model that just occurred to me. Despite the pushing back we're seeing in America against the changes, particularly related to women, people of color, trans people, change came because of small groups. It started in small groups of women getting together and
speaking the truth like they do in Tomorrow's Women, if every one of you went home and started organizing discussions like this in your house with your friends, making space for every voice to be heard, you would be making one step towards making change. Why is that so hard to do?
Maybe I'll share a little bit, since sort of in New Mexico, and I know there's an audience online, but some of you are familiar with the Santa Clara Pueblo, which is near Española, outside of Santa Fe. And there's a woman there, Marian Naranjo, and she has a very small but wonderful organization. And some of the things that they focus on are, dealing with Los Alamos labs and some of the nuclear waste and things like that, and how it's come down into the Pueblo, but also an indigenous food movement. And I bring her up, not only is she inspiring and local and doing things right now, and I think brings a lot of sort of spirituality into her activism, a lot of presence, but we bring the young women from Israel, Palestine, and some of the American girls to the Pueblo, and she has a women's lodge, and she'll do kind of a ceremony with the girls, but it's, there's a lot of indigenous connections, right, with Palestine, and of course Israel, and the plight of the indigenous here. But so we did that, but she wanted to do an exchange. She wanted to come out to the camp. So on the opening day, she came out, and she got the girls into a circle, and the camp is out near Galisteo. It's gorgeous. And so we're outside under the cottonwoods, and she, takes some ceremonial corn, and and each girl had it in her hand, and she walked around each girl. And she finished, and she sort of took a deep breath, and she said, I have a few words for you. She said, you need to forget. And you talked a little bit about the memory, right, and the narratives that kind of get like pulled through, into society, and then how people act on them. And for her to share that with these young women was incredibly powerful. Mm-hmm. So I encourage you to look her up, Marian Naranjo. She does wonderful work here locally.
Again, for everyone, is there a particular moment of your career that stands out the most as hope for the future?
Okay, I guess I'm like bringing the hope today.
No pressure.
No pressure. Well, this happened before October 7th. So this summer, NBC News came out to the camp, and a producer came out twice. She's a Lebanese-American producer, and she's married to a Jewish man, so it was like very close to her to share this story. And she interviewed the girls that wanted to be interviewed, not everybody, and it wasn't always safe. Some of the interviews took place without showing any faces for the girls in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And just sitting there and listening to these 15, 16-year-old young women talk about not just their hopes, but also just their belief that this doesn't have to be like this, that this is something that actually is so solvable if people will come together, if the right people will come into leadership and come together. And so just listening to them, listening to their wisdom and their courage, and knowing that they're being interviewed to go on to NBC News, which then it got broadcast a couple of months ago. That gives me hope. That gives me hope that they still believe. And I bet and I know, actually, I've talked to some of those same young women after this, as like broken as they are right now, they absolutely still believe, because they know that the connections that they had, mm-hmm. and they know that that's because they got to come together, and that if larger groups were able to come together in this way, it would be different.
Yeah, I had similar experiences. For 6 years, I directed an organization called the Program for Torture Victims in Los Angeles. This was an agency, it still is, that provides medical, psychological, and legal services to victims of state-sponsored torture. One of the things that I came away with is that telling the story is very, very important for these people who've experienced what they've experienced. And the reason it's very important is it turns the victim into a witness. And that is powerful when they are able to do that. So again, narrative, storytelling, having somebody listen to them is a powerful thing.
And I'll share a resource because I think people are hungry for that. I mean, as it pertains to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So maybe some of you have read Carl McCann's book, A Paragon. Carl McCann is an Irish author, and so he comes out of that conflict and wrote about this, and it's a beautiful book. But I share it not only because it's just wonderful to read, and it's something, you know, not balanced, but it sort of shares both perspectives. And he's an amazing author, if you haven't read him, Colin McCann. But he started an organization called Narrative 4, and they came to Santa Fe. If anyone was at the Santa Fe Literary Festival this year, they came, and we actually did an event with them. We brought American high school young women who are in our programs to this, and they sit and they'll tell each other stories, and they're usually loaded stories, emotional stories, and then the other person will tell that to the small group. So they sort of narrate for the other person, but there's so much power in sort of getting it out and then having someone else retell it. And that's some of the work that he's taken from his experience. So that's Narrative 4, but Colin McCann is a great author.
I can just mention something really briefly along these lines. A story that I did about a decade ago in Uruguay, which is a really tiny country, 3 million people, sort of wedged between Brazil and Argentina. But I went there to interview the president of Uruguay, who at that time was José Mujica, who is just an amazing person with an incredible life experience. And he was a former leftist guerrilla who was captured and imprisoned by Uruguay's dictatorship and spent more than a decade in solitary confinement, much of that in an actual hole in the ground, and by his own admission and description went kind of crazy during that time, and it was an extremely, extremely difficult experience for him. And when he was finally released from Uruguay, and I spent a wonderful afternoon with him at his house on the outskirts of Montevideo. He, refused to live in the palace, and he was just living in this very humble home, running the country from there, driving a little VW Bug, and just an incredible person. But he was recounting that experience and telling me how, well, he had options. Many of his people who were in a similar situation decided to leave Uruguay. They could go to, live in Sweden, or they could, come and spend some time at a university here in the United States. And he, despite the very strong possibility that he would be coming face to face with the people who put him in that type of imprisonment and confinement, many times over in a very small country, very small society like Uruguay, he chose to remain in the country and go into politics and do what was possible. And I just think that that's just an incredible example of someone who does provide a lot of hope, despite everything that he went through, to stay in his own society, his own community, and still continue to work for change. And then, as a leader, he just accomplished a hell of a lot. And really today, many countries around the region in Latin America have a lot of big problems, but Uruguay, in the big scheme of things, is not doing so badly, I think. There's a real commitment to liberal democracy and to institutional stability, to government transparency, and I think it has to do with people just sticking around and deciding that they have to work together on that. I think he's a real example of that.
Maybe I'll follow that up with something that's really relevant to the conflict that's happening right now. Is he's a Gazan doctor. Maybe you've read his book, I Shall Not Hate. His name is Izzeldin Abuelaish, and he, he's inspiring in his own right. And so he lost, in 2009, he lost 3 daughters to an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. One of those girls was one of our alums. And we've dedicated our Gaza Girls program to her and to him. But he is sort of back in the news again. And from that, he wrote this book, I Shall Not Hate. It's being made into a movie, a film, which is obviously very relevant now. And he just went back on the news again. We're in contact with him. And he lost 24 members of his family in this recent war. And he still is committed to peace. He's still committed, and there's a lawsuit against the Israelis for this 2009 strike. Like, he's still, following sort of the levers of justice. But he started a foundation called Daughters for Life. It's about giving, scholarships to Palestinian young women. And he's still out there. Losing those 3 daughters, and then now, and he still speaks openly about peace. And then he's also just an active doctor, an academic. He lives in Canada now. But his name is Izzeldin Abuelaish, and I Shall Not Hate is a great book if you'd like to read it right now.
I'd like to actually follow up with this as well. I recently, in fact, just a few days ago, heard a podcast by an Israeli psychologist who actually studies hope. And he has done research before October 7th, but even after, in the last few weeks. And he had something interesting to say about hope. He said that it has kind of 2 dimensions. One dimension is what we desire, our aspiration. We want peace. So when you interview Palestinians and Israelis, even now, last few weeks, that hope, that aspiration for peace actually remains intact for most, not for all, but for most. What gets in the way is there's another dimension to hope. That's the one that says, well, I really want this, I hope for this, but it's an intractable situation. I just don't see how we can move forward given the situation. His conclusion is that if we focus actually on the first dimension of hope, the one which is aspirational, the desire that we know that the other, quote unquote, has, then we're more likely to be activists and more likely to do something. But if we focus on the barriers, that hope kind of gets stillborn, so to speak. And I thought that was very powerful, and very powerful to know that even now, there is that aspirational hope on both sides. I just wanted to formally close the session, first of all, by thanking our panelists. So, just last thoughts. Towards the end of his book, Candide, Voltaire tells the following story. Candide and Pangloss and Martin pass an old Turkish man who is sitting next to his house. Pangloss asks the man about a particular bit of news concerning an execution in Constantinople. The man replies, quote, I have no idea what you're talking about. My general view is that people who meddle in politics usually meet a miserable end, and indeed, they deserve to. I never bother with what's going on in Constantinople. I only worry about sending the fruits of the garden which I cultivate to be sold there. Then the man invites Candide and Martin Pangloss to share a meal with him. On their way home, Candide reflects on the old man's words and says to his companions, quote, this honest Turk seems to be in a far better place than kings. I also know that we must cultivate our garden. We must cultivate our garden. Now, I think that Voltaire doesn't mean that we must all stay in our little plot of land and worry only about ourselves. our garden is very big indeed. It includes our family, our neighborhood, our community, our society, our world. And note that in Voltaire's story, the old man invites the travelers to share a meal, a small but meaningful act of civility. And there are many, as we have talked about, there are many venues, wonderful initiatives, organizations, programs where we can sit together and help cultivate the garden that is our world. Despair is a non-starter. As Eleanor Roosevelt wrote when she was fighting for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, quote, "It isn't enough to talk about peace, one must believe in it. And it isn't enough to believe in it, one must work at it." Thanks for joining us this afternoon.